realistically achieve its net zero emissions um, and whether it can do so at the targeted timeline by 2070 or not. Um, Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, good having you on the show today. Net zero, what does this really mean for a country like India, and does it seem like achievable or a distant dream?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. First of all, let me say that the announcement made by the Prime Minister is very significant and bold. And why is it so? Because India is a fast-growing economy. So it is for us, there's a lot of debate around net zero, but for us, it is not just about net zero. India's emissions have to peak first. So we are on the rising trajectory, upward rising trajectory. So a net zero announcement simply means at some point in time, maybe 20, 25 years from now, the Indian economy's emissions have to peak, and from there it has to go down to net zero. And that is why this 50-year time frame, it appears to be too much. But what it simply means is, let's say if the lifetime of a coal power plant is 40 years, it simply means post 2030, it would not be feasible to invest in a new coal power plant, because it has to economy has to go to net zero by 2070. So essentially, it is a pretty bold economic transition agenda or transformation agenda. There have to be many significant reforms that have to be taken, and 50-year the time period, it appears to be pretty long, but from the feasibility perspective, for a fast-growing economy where emissions are on the rising curve, incomes are low, and many sort of political economy challenges are there. It's a bold yet realistically bold, so to speak. So it is a great target. I do think it has a potential to shake global energy markets, and which are anyways going to shift now with India's announcement. The writing on the wall is very clear, and the investors in this particular sector, in the energy sector, and there are a bunch of very different kinds of people in the across the value chain. I do think the early movers will definitely gain, and that's what the Prime Minister has done. I think it is very important for policymakers to give a very strong and bold policy signal. And in India's energy sector, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty was there. Now that uncertainty goes away, and that is a very important role of the policy frameworks, to give certainty to the investors. And this is what I do believe that this announcement has done. And now we'll see, many investors, stakeholders kind of aligning around this target and moving in, this particular direction. So it is something very positive for India's economy, in my view.
Sure, sure. But that's exactly what I want to probe a little bit more about, this energy transition that you're talking about. We've already seen the government's thrust towards, ethanol usage, for instance. Will it have to take for the government to make a conscious transition to move away from fossil fuels and go solar and electric and hydro as well?
It is. So it is a conscious transition. And in fact, as I said, 2070 net zero means there is no room, there's going to be, or rather very, very little room for fossil fuels in the economy of the future. Now that is Prime Minister has very clearly kind of said this time. And earlier there was a lot, if you look at, see India's, all the earlier targets at the international level, they've always been about emission intensity of GDP or a percentage share of renewable energy, something like that. So this is the first time it has happened that we have kind of gone for absolute emission cuts. And that's a very big departure from the earlier policy approach. So now, of course, it means very clearly that, fossil has to go out of the system. And the investors have to read this signal and start aligning well. And it does mean a lot of, much more focus on solar. We already had a lot of focus, but it simply means we are going to up the game on solar. Hydrogen, we know that India also announced a hydrogen mission, national hydrogen mission. And two of our biggest business conglomerates, Adani and Reliance, they've already started talking about investing big on hydrogen, big on renewable energy. So we are already seeing these sort of changes happening or actions happening in the private sector. Ultimately, what policies and markets have to come together. It cannot be just policy, because the money is being put by investors on the table. The role of policy is to give that kind of long-term guidance, which is given now. So investors have to start making these moves. Many moves are already very clear. Some of the moves, like carbon capture and storage, it might not happen for the next 20-25 years. It's another very interesting technology. But in future, when our incomes are higher, when the affordability of many of the energy services is much higher for Indian households, then many of the other interesting technologies like carbon capture and storage could also come in. And in fact, when we did some work on CCS some time back, we started getting call for from manufacturing companies, because carbon capture and storage is another big opportunity, and similar to solar and hydrogen. Essentially, there would be many opportunities for domestic manufacturing in this sector. When fossil goes away, well, there's another sector that are expected to rise. The question is who moves first and who starts gaining from this transition. At the same time, it is this opportunity, but there are also significant political economic challenges. For example, electricity pricing reforms is one of the extremely important policy reform that has to be undertaken. We have been dealing with our electricity distribution sector problems for so long now. We have not managed to kind of solve it. That definitely makes it much more challenging, because the electricity sector reforms have to undertaken. We know there is a cross subsidy, so electricity has to be is very expensive for the industrial sector. Electrification of the economy has to go under a net zero scenario is one of the most important pathways. If we look at the pathways toward net zero, electrification of industrial sector is going to be critical. But with such an expensive electricity, it cannot happen. So the government at some point of time, maybe not in the next 5 years, but maybe definitely in the next 20 years or so, it has to start biting these very difficult bullets. And only when these kind of reforms are undertaken, we will see a lot more electrification. At the same time, I do believe it will make our manufacturing sector more competitive, right? So now all of these have to come together, but essentially it's an economic transformation agenda.
Yeah.
It's a reform agenda. We need to understand, we need to think about this net zero in this particular perspective.
Right. Right. And of course, the transition will have to be funded. So financing is going to be a key aspect as well, I'm guessing. Vaibhav, great having you on the show. Thanks for sharing all that insight.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.